Hello, Darkness here. Before we begin, I have some great news. But first, I'd like to plug in two really great channels. My pal Kevin Marr has a channel, Kevin Marr the Informer, and he pissed off Roy, he knew him, about 6 or 7 times back in '74 when he worked for Balkini, a boss he discusses a lot in his book, Cop Without a Badge. Not a lot, but a little bit. And that came out in the mid-'90s, so you don't think he's just jumping on the Roy bandwagon all of a sudden. He didn't know Roy was a big deal. And if you think Roy's scary, you gotta read his book. His wife, his ex-wife, she's even scarier. She's a monster. Also, check out Dana Trappiana and her mob channel. It has a myriad of diverse gangsters from Sam DiCavalcante to Nicky Scarfo. Women love true crime, but they rarely seem to be interested in mob channels or mob videos or mob stuff. At least I don't notice them into it that much. But she's a mob encyclopedia. Check out her channel. It's great. And Dana, I hope I didn't butcher your name too terribly. Next, the great news. Well, Pete LaFrocia is with me and B-Riv over at New York Crime Spot. I introduced them. He's no longer with Irish Luck. They had a bad falling out, which I foresaw happening. Joey Diaz, I reached out to him. He seems interested in having me on for an interview when I'm done with my book. Pete, he's not going to be talking about murders or anything that's going to get people in further trouble. Anything he might ever tell me about that, I agree not to release anything in the book that's going to get somebody further in trouble. He doesn't want to be a snitch. Okay. And it's not like we're talking about victims like what Ted Bundy did here. These are criminal on criminal crimes where they both know the rules of what they're getting into. So, enough about that. Let's start the show. When Nino agreed to El Negro's demand that Chris be killed in retribution for the few men Chris had set up, Montiglio felt a flush of pleasure. He considered Roy a psycho scumbag who would punk out and run if he ever needed it. He didn't like Chris any more than he did Roy. In today's rhetoric, Chris would be like a mini-me of Roy. Well, now Montiglio finally got to watch Roy really suffer after years of acting like a sadistic maniac. "I'll take care of it," Roy said sadly, near tears. Of course, weeks had passed, and he still hadn't, and so Dominic said, "What's going on? El Negro and Paz? They're getting antsy. I'm trying. Chris is a hard guy to set up," Roy said. Well, that was more of Roy's bullshit. They worked out together at a Long Island exercise club and renovated Chris's Queens waterfront home together. Chris was completely oblivious. His blood had been demanded for what he set up. Of course, the twins had also been involved, and Henry too, but that didn't matter since El Negro knew this crew was only going to comply with so much. Basically, what a Pyrrhic victory would be in this case is there'd be a lot of dead guys on both sides. The remainders would probably get arrested. You can't really do stuff like that in America like you can, Colombia at the time, Mexico now, and a lot of lost businesses. Who wants that? They do need to be respected. They're not going to let Roy walk away from this without any sacrifice. So several weeks passed, with Roy lurking in his fortified suburban mansion, stockpile weapons with him. Joseph Guelmo was also with him. And if there was anybody who was less stable than Roy, well, Joseph Guelmo. These are the two guys you don't want near weapons. Not even near a spoon. I swear to God. These two, at this point, are just psychologically deteriorating. So, despite Roy's intelligence, his instability was impairing his critical thinking skills. Guelmo wasn't much safer to be around either. He had a history of violence, including slicing a cop's face off and nearly killing him. That was back in the early 50s. Roy would watch the neighborhood through cameras, windows, and peepholes like Big Brother, to see if every passing car was a Cuban hitman. They weren't going to get the drop on the butcher. No way, Roy decided. Every letter and package had to be treated as if it was contaminated with poison or bomb. The unforeseeable had to become foreseeable. If he wanted to survive, he decided. If those Cuban motherfuckers wanted to get to him. And it was under these grim conditions, on the 5th day, the 5th week of the Cuban crisis, that the rooster finally just snapped. And this led to one of the most tragic murders of all the people that Roy killed. It was April 19, 1979. Around 7 p.m., the sun was setting, casting a gloomy twilight across the placid, upscale neighborhood. A 1971 Cadillac drove past the large, wealthy homes with carefully lawned yards. It was a pristine neighborhood that obviously took pride in itself. The driver, Dominic Ragucci, was an 18-year-old vacuum cleaner salesman. He was half Puerto Rican, and his dad was Italian. He was a handsome young man. He looked a little bit older than he was because he had grown a mustache out. But, he wouldn't have any reason to think about what's coming up is going to happen. I don't think anybody would. Ragucci had graduated Valley Forge Military Academy with honors in '79 when he'd been a member of the cross-country team. Now he was studying at Nassau Community College. A bright future ahead of him. He was studying criminal justice there. Wanted to be a cop someday. Probably would have been a really good one. He seemed like a nice kid. He had gone into business for himself, selling vacuum cleaners to save whatever he needed to for scholarships. Unlike Roy, he didn't have a huge savings he could have used to attend wherever he wanted. Ragucci wanted to save up his college funds, and he did want to do it on his own. And he was also using the money earned from his job to pay for dates with his girlfriend. He intended on marrying, to keep a '71 Cadillac he was proud of, looking nice. And it's a cliche, but it is accurate to say here that Dominic Ragucci was a nice, responsible kid, the type that most parents with any good values would be happy to have dating their daughter. The day Ragucci was dressed in gray slacks and suit, little flowery tie. It was popular in the '70s. It was a conservative, professional look to show he was serious about work. He had several vacuum cleaners in his back seat and an appointment just down the hill from Roy's, when Ragucci rolled in and stopped in front of 162 Whitewood Drive. That's Roy's grim mansion address. It was quiet. Raguchi pulled on his notebook, again making marks or writing notes. He might have gotten out of the car for a moment to look around, thinking, and that's when this nightmarish situation occurred. It's a situation of madness. So the following happened. It's around 7 on Thursday, and 5th day of the 5th week of the Cuban crisis. Suddenly, Roy and Dracula just burst out the door of the front of their house with wild eyes and began advancing toward Raguchi's car, brandishing guns in their hands, like a version of the Neighborhood Watch, except this Neighborhood Watch is straight out of hell. To Roy and his erratic cousin, Raguchi, who was half Italian and half Puerto Rican, looked like Cuban hitmen. When Raguchi spotted these two lunatics coming towards him and cursing at him, brandishing their weapons, he's like, "What the fuck?" Gets in his car and he jettisons off. Well, to Roy and Dracula in their semi-psychotic states, indifferent to life, even eager to kill other people, running away says, "Guilty? Why would he run away? If he wasn't guilty, never mind the guns." So Roy charged and leaped into his late model blue Cadillac, capable of going faster than the older versions, which includes Raguchi's. Dracula jumped in the passenger seat beside him, and they shot off after the Cuban assassin wannabe. Raguchi had to be horrified, terrified, and utterly baffled when he saw these two lunatics speeding after him. Well, it made no sense. Why would anybody want to kill him? Why are these people bothering him? Especially in this classic, bucolic neighborhood. The two cars began racing along the road, passing and swerving other cars. They would leave Massapequa and finally find themselves in a bustling thoroughfare in downtown Amityville, dodging cars like they were playing a video game. And of course, not a single fucking cop would be around in this 7-mile chase that continued on. They're never around when you need them. The car shook, veering left to the right. Raguchi pinned his foot against the pedal and sped faster, moving along. He had to go in between cars, almost wrecking, racing along Route 110 at deadly speeds. He undoubtedly glanced back with wide, terrified eyes at the maniacs that continued to follow him. It was madness, a nightmare, without any explanation. Maybe a dozen meters behind Raguchi, Roy shoved even harder on the pedal of his own Cadillac. The two cars began racing along the road, passing and swerving through other cars. They would leave Massapequa and eventually find themselves in a bustling thoroughfare, with cars going everywhere. Fuck, great. Amityville, dodging cars? This is like playing a video game. And of course not a single fucking cop was still around. Not in the entire 7-mile chase that would keep going and going and going. The car shook, veering to the right and left. Raguchi pinned his foot against the pedal and sped faster. Maybe a dozen meters behind Raguchi, Roy shoved his foot even harder on the pedal of his own Cadillac. While driving, Roy passed the steering wheel over to Guelmo and quickly shoved his upper torso out the window. Roy, partially outside his car now, the wind blowing his dark hair back, hammered the trigger of his gun with his finger until it was empty. Roy dropped back into the car and took back control of the wheel. Then he handed his empty pistol to Guelmo, who quickly began loading it. Must have hit that car, Raguchi's car, about 5 times. Bumping up and down, Guelmo, in the meantime, is fumbling to load the pistol in between his spread knees, the barrel ponied down. Guelmo accidentally fired his gun, blowing holes through the floorboards. At this point, Guelmo probably cursed because of his clumsiness, and Roy probably shouted curses at him. Again, the chase lasted 7 miles through downtown Amityville now, with Raguchi never having a clue why the hell these fucking lunatics are chasing him, and firing a gun into his car. Roy shattered several of Raguchi's windows with gunfire, shooting holes in his car, flattening his tires, and despite the dire situation which Raguchi was in, racing around confused drivers, he handled himself pretty well. He was pretty brave. You know, he didn't make too many mistakes, and if it wasn't for the fact that he had a slower car, he would have gotten away. Descriptions of how it ended are conflicting. Raguchi might have been shot, though not fatally, and he eventually crashed into another car. And then he, from there, trundled on about 500 feet before the car just stopped and gave up. that car was destroyed. With crazed eyes, Roy rolled up next to him, and then he leaped out of his car, stalked over with his semi-automatic, got into a kind of military position, aimed and fired, while Ragucci was still trapped in his seatbelt. And he unloaded. All the while, other cars were speeding past, people witnessing what was happening, but too afraid or cowardly, depending on how you look at it, to get involved. The bucolic area had become a nightmarish circus. Roy unloaded into the kids, and then stalked away, leaping into his own Cadillac and driving off. Only one person ever stopped to help, even after Ragucci was dead and the murderers were gone, and that man just had enough chutzpah to turn Ragucci's ignition off, which didn't really matter to him anymore, before he realized the killers might come back, and then he fled off again too. When the police and reporters learned what happened, they were astonished so many people refused to come forward and describe the killers, or get involved in any way whatsoever. The cops couldn't learn more than there had only been 2 men, and they didn't really get much of a description, and the cops quickly presumed it must have been over a traffic dispute, though they would learn later that that was very incorrect. The next day, Roy picked up the paper when it arrived, and he sifted through the pages, desperate to find out information about the assassin he just clipped. Roy trembled, his eyes expanding in horror. Dominic Ragucci? He was some kid who sold Electrolux vacuums? He only looked like a man because of his mustache. There would be far more stories and more newspapers over the coming month about this poor murdered kid. The victim's dad, Ben Ragucci, owned a shop called Jetmore Fireplace Center in Wantagh, not that far from where Roy lived. The papers claimed hundreds of people must have witnessed what happened. Yeah, that was probably true. Roy barely noticed them in his despondent eagerness to murder this guy, an eagerness and paranoia that might have been exacerbated by cocaine and alcohol. Though that's speculation on my part. Not bad speculation, though. Nobody who saw anything would ever come forward, not even those who immediately turned off Ragucci's engine before fleeing. If anybody ever did see anything, they didn't say it. Most people are more interested in self-preservation than they are being a hero. You might call most people cowards or say they are irrational. 2 obviously deadly men just murdered somebody they didn't know for reasons they didn't understand. They weren't prepared to deal with whatever happened, so they stayed quiet. The streets have a code of not snitching. White-collar workers are simply afraid. Perhaps the underworld and the rest of the country might have something in common. Perhaps the don't snitch street code has less to do with misguided honor than it does fear. When Roy found out his victim wasn't a hitman, he began to sob. Some of his family would learn the truth. He may or may not have told Gladys the detail, but she knew enough to begin emotionally distancing herself from him. His wife never imagined anything like this when they married. Gladys hadn't even wanted to marry a career criminal. She wasn't the type to go after bad boys. Roy would tell Albert that he cried because he had killed an innocent kid, and that's also a story that Robert DeMeo, the younger brother of Richie and Freddie, would all come to believe. But it probably wasn't true. Is that really going to be the reason why Roy's sobbing? Because he just killed some kid he didn't know about? When this is a guy who's a serial killer who kills people that he doesn't know that well, and he enjoys it. Who were you, Roy? Were you always honest about your feelings? Or were you wearing your mask of sanity, hiding your darkness underneath? He was weeping because he knew that Nino was going to really pressure him now, demand that he kill Harvey Rosenberg. Harvey Rosenberg meant the world to Roy. That was the closest person to him, and he's somebody who had trouble bonding, probably as a psychopath. He couldn't imagine that the horror, the dawning horror that he was going to have to kill Chris was causing him to cry. That's one reason. Then, of course, there's another reason. Roy had always had grandiose visions for himself. It's pretty obvious why he worked so hard. Well, now it didn't look like he was even going to get promoted to capital. Paul, once he found out about this, he might want to kill Roy. There's a good chance he'll want to kill Roy. Mobsters aren't supposed to act like this. Come completely out of control. Paul's not going to even want to be around him. He's too dangerous to be around. He's definitely not going to get promoted any higher. Unless he gets really lucky. He's just going to have to work harder and harder. But this might be the beginning of the end for Roy. He lost so much control like that. Nobody wants to promote a capo who seems unstable around him. Rank doesn't mean much when a guy shoots you. His days might really be numbered now, unless he can pull off a miracle and smooth things over for Paul and Nino. But that still meant killing Chris. So, of course, that would be the main reason why Roy would have cried, not some kid he didn't know anything about. He wasn't a nice guy, and he didn't want to seem like a monster to his son Albert or his wife, so he made that excuse. When Roy went to Nino's house and told Nino that he was responsible for this murder, Nino was understandably angry. An 18-year-old vacuum cleaner salesman? Huh, Roy? Nino, I'm telling you, I thought he was going to take out my whole house. That's when Montiglio interrupted. I told you the Cubans weren't going to make a move yet. I have the situation under control. Oh, fuck you! You weren't there, Roy snapped. Okay, Rooster, cock-a-doodle-doo, Montiglio mocked him. He called Roy Rooster because Roy had that little flab of skin when he got fat under his chin that would hang down. Roy hated being called Rooster. If anybody else called him that, he'd probably shoot him. Roy responded, What'd you say? You better watch your smart ass. That's when Nino interrupted both of them sternly. Alright, morons, that's it. Roy's gonna take care of this stupid bullshit before there are any other people getting killed. Just end it. Of course, instead of immediately ending it, Roy instead had Freddy do reconnaissance on Ben Ragucci's place because the grieving father was offering a generous reward of finding the killers. Roy was thinking about having his father killed now, too, just so that he could try to get away with this. Detective Murphy, in the meantime, figured out it must be Roy and his crew because they were the only people who would act this crazy when he picked up the newspaper. Montiglio continued to visit the Cubans and Paz flatly told Dominic, Is this going to happen or what? If it isn't, we're going to take care of it, and who knows what will happen. Dominic replied, You want to start it? Fine. You ain't scared of them, but they ain't scared of you either. So, lots of people are going to die. Be patient. Let the Italians straighten out their own problems. Montiglio then flew to Florida to talk to Nino, bringing along Cheryl Anderson, that was one of his fuck toys at the time, and Matt Rega, the coke dealer. Nino called Roy, and he made it clear, do it now, no more excuses. So Roy immediately called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, only Chris wasn't invited this time, for the first time. He didn't even know about it. Roy was on the verge of tears. When Roy arrived, he was devastated, thinking of that Chris is going to have to die in front of Henry and the twins and Freddy. And he suggests he can just barely go through with this. That's when Henry chipped in helpfully. I'll do the work, Henry said grimly. Henry acted grim, but when he was offering to kill Chris that night, the reality was Henry wanted to be the one to kill that motherfucker anyway. For a long time, Henry hoped Chris would fuck up badly enough to the point that he needed to be clipped. Henry was happy that the day had finally come. Now he could only hope that Roy would let him do the honors. No, I have to do it. I love that kid, Roy said sadly. Henry was undoubtedly secretly chagrined. In the meantime, nobody among the crew had ever seen Roy so filled with grief and a reluctance to hurt somebody. The killing machine finally had a dent in him. Chris's execution was set that night. The dates were known. Roy instructed the twins to be on time. He told Henry and Freddy to show up late. They were going to kill him that Friday, shape-up night. So that Friday quickly came. Chris pulled up in his expensive hoodie. The twins arrived too. Chris left his gun in a suitcase with a lot of cash, and then he hustled inside. Roy sat with the gun, paper bag at the kitchen table. Dracula was probably there too, maybe making food or just watching. The twins came and sat down. Roy walked over and smiled to Chris and kissed him on the cheek, an Italian display of affection. They sat down, and before Chris realized what was happening, Roy flipped his gun out and fired. Chris stumbled backwards, holding his head, with blood pouring through his fingers. When he wiped it away from his face, staggering to get up, he looked at Roy with the most hurt eyes, just the eyes of betrayal, devastated that Roy would shoot him, realizing that Roy, the guy he had loved the most in the world, had just betrayed him. Roy stared in horror at what he had done, struggling to press the trigger just one more time and end his friend's pain. It had to be done. Fortunately, Anthony Center, he didn't have those concerns. He immediately stood up and fired 4 more shots into Chris's head, while he staggered with one knee on the floor. For Anthony, it went a lot easier than it had been for Roy. A lot easier. He didn't like Chris much more than Henry did. Albert, in his book, For the Sins of My Fathers, said he noticed Anthony give Chris cold stares sometimes at Roy's house. Then, Albert dismissed it as Anthony disliked Chris because of jealousy over his father's affections. I think Chris was occasionally a jerk when he was in charge. I think it had more to do with that than simply jealousy. Of course, Anthony was allegedly lazy, and sometimes when they worked together, he could be lazy. So then Chris would have a reason to be a jerk in that case. Either way, Harvey was dead, off into whatever place the gods send coked up car thieves who like charging people with knives while wearing nothing but jockey shorts. After that, Joey and Anthony took towels or whatever else was sufficient and available and wiped the blood off Harvey's face, scrubbing it so that their dead friend's wounds weren't leaking blood. Then they carried Harvey outside arm in arm, their arms under his, like he's still alive and he's just drunk or sick. They escorted him over to his wife's BMW. That's what he had arrived in. And they settled him inside. Anthony got in the driver's seat, and he jettisoned off with Harvey's corpse. Joey would eventually follow in his own car to spy and see what was going on. Now it's time to introduce another one of the major players of the Mob Squad, and that's a collection of the key players in law enforcement who took down Roy and his Gemini crew, and Paul Castellano and Nino. Now this person is someone I'm very close friends with in real life. We've developed a very close friendship. We love talking to each other. I swear to God, he's 80, and it's like talking to a guy who's younger than me. Former homicide detective Frank Pergola. And he played one of the most important roles, not in bringing down Roy, because Roy was no longer leading the crew by 83, and that's when he really started kicking in and getting a hold of this case, because he wasn't assigned to it before that. He was very important in bringing to justice the remains of the crew, which were most of them by that point. So McCabe and Anthony Nelson and Mac, they brought Roy down. Pergola probably played the most important role in bringing down many of the other members of the crew, including the Gemini twins, and of solving the homicide. And I got to tell you right now, the most important work that a police officer, a very important police officer, does isn't in the gunfights. Yeah, they're cool. Yeah, that's fun. But a lot of the most important work, a lot of the hardest work where the battles are fought, happens in the file with those unsolved cases. And Frank Pergola, well, he'd solved 70-something homicides connected to the DeMeo crew as of last year. I think we're at 80 now, because he's solved a bunch more. He's found a whole bunch more since he started working on this with me prodding him. And I actually helped him find a few. And B-Riv over at New York Crime Spot, he saw one first, I saw it later. That's Constance. I'll detail her fate in my book. And there's some others I'm just not going to tell you until it's in my book. But a lot of new homicides. Capici, Mustang, they left out some of the most dramatic, fascinating homicides. I choked when I saw what they left out. Anyway, you might not agree with Pergola's political views or his sense of humor or whatever. But I'll tell you right now, he's an excellent cop, an extremely intelligent person, and a very moral guy. The complete opposite of what Roy's moral values were. Now it's time to continue this story with his. Frank Pergola was born in Brooklyn in 1938, 2 years before Roy. By the way, this is coming straight from my book. It's unedited, but it's coming straight from my book. so it's just a little passage here. And I took a lot of it out, though, too. So Frank had been born in Brooklyn in 1938, 2 years before Roy, and grew up in Bath Beach. Frank's parents had done a good job at their responsibilities. His dad was a tailor who raised his family comfortably, but taught him that there were things in the world more important than your every greedy inclination. When he was a kid sauntering home one day, he picked up a baseball lying on the ground nearby. His dad told him, "Don't take things that don't belong to you." Then he seized the ball and threw it over the house. It was quite a different lesson Roy was learning, which his mom was teaching him, which is take everything that will make me happy. Frank was an upbeat man. He always was. He's got a thick Brooklyn accent and a rusty voice. He was about average height, is about average height still, and medium build. His blonde hair was already beginning to retreat from his forehead. That's okay, the broads still liked him, especially the woman who really mattered to Frank, his wife Margaret. Frank began dating Margaret in the late 50s. Margaret was a beautiful brunette with a cheerful smile. The pair were both devoted Catholics, so religion wasn't going to be a problem. Margaret was Irish, Frank's Italian, but neither cared about that, or if they did, it only made them more attracted to each other. And, well, as far as smoking went, imagine this. They might have been sitting next to each other, watching I Love Lucy on a wooden black and white box television in the 50s, casually talking about the show, and at every moment they'd slide one Camel after another into their lips because that was pretty common back then. That's back when tobacco companies were doing everything they could to lobby politicians to keep their mouths shut about how dangerous that habit can be. So they didn't have to worry about that. Neither of them were going to care that the other smoked. In fact, Frank himself was putting away 2 packs of Camels a day. Their house was probably pouring more smoke out of its windows due to their nicotine pleasure than a house fire could. Now, Margaret's dad didn't like Italians, but he eventually got over that, so that was only a brief problem. Now, Margaret also enjoyed knitting and watching the tube with her friends, and she had patience to deal with her husband's long absences while he was out doing police work. Funny enough, Frank and Margaret lived just a block away from Nino and Dominic in their bunker home. They lived in Bath Beach. Not that Frank knew any of this at the time. It was like different worlds. In New York City, a single block could be the span of the Pacific Ocean when neighborhoods are concerned. Bath Beach was a small area, only about 15 avenues. But during the 1940s through 70s, if you wanted to do business, you did business with the mob. They were your neighbors and had money, and money that invested back into businesses. Frank, he thought, well, there's one of 3 things you get to be in this neighborhood at that time. Everybody became a police officer, a firefighter, or a mobster. Those were just the 3 dominant careers with the limited opportunities they had then. So Frank, he noticed the dead people in the street and thought, I don't want it to be one of those. I'm going to become a cop. And it was a job he was well suited to because he's a very intelligent investigator, and he ended up solving many of the DeMeo murders. They would certainly regret ever having him in their midst. Now, this all started with the Son of Sam murders. Remember the Son of Sam? Well, Frank, he was working on the Son of Sam, and he had to stay up late at night to try to figure out who else did this guy kill. Who else? Did we miss anybody? And as he was flipping through the files, he saw Andrew Katz, and he's like, what the hell? Whoever did this, they make the Son of Sam look almost like Mother Teresa. He glanced at those files and how horrific what they had done to this kid was. And he looked at their names. Okay, so there was Joey Testa, Henry Borelli, Chris Rosenberg, and Anthony Center. Those were the suspects involved. Okay, well, he just never forgot those names. So on that evening that Chris was killed, Frank, he went to his closet and he put on one of his suit coats. All of his suit coats looked the same. He bought suit coats so that he didn't have to think about it one after another, so he always wore the same clothes, but they were always clean. It was a new suit coat. But they looked just like the last one. And he heads out. Sometimes he gets some pizza, it's late at night. And all of a sudden he gets a radio in. There's been machine gun fire, and somebody, it looks like, was murdered over near Ebbets Field. Oh, well, okay. He drives on over to Ebbets Field, not realizing what was going to happen that night, how big this night was going to be for both the crew and his future. So he gets there. There are only a few people there at this time. It's really dead quiet. You know, people heard the gunshots and they called the cops, but there's not really many people out 1 o'clock at night in the morning when he gets there. The ambulance is leaving, and there are just a couple cops who had found it. So Frank comes on over. He's the detective in charge, and he looks in there, and there, sure enough, there's Chris. And he realizes immediately this isn't where Chris was murdered. All of their attempts at misdirection failed. First of all, Anthony Center, when he was trying to get out of the car, and when he was trying to leave Chris in a way that would look inconspicuous, you know, like he'd just been shot there, well, he left him in between the seats. People just don't sit that way. Second of all, your circulatory system, it dies with you. It quits pumping blood once you're dead. So he can see the matted blood around his head from all the gunshots. He definitely died there, because all the machine gun fire that Henry fired, they're all pink. They're pink dots because his blood's no longer circulating there. Kind of gruesome. Hollywood murders are a lot less macabre than real life death. So he's like, okay, this happened somewhere else. So he gets out. What's the victim's name? Chris Rosalia. He had changed his last name. Okay, he looks down the street, and all of a sudden he sees this creepy Mercedes sports coupe down the street with a guy watching them. It's kind of creepy. And there are only a few cops there. Pergola, he walks on over to him, and Joey Testa rolls down the window. They don't know who each other are yet. I noticed what looked like my friend Chris Rosenberg's car while I was passing by. I'm shocked. The police told me that it is his car and he's dead, Joey said. Joey's eyes were filled with tears, and they were stained pink from his anguish. Unlike Anthony, or Dominic Montiglio, or especially Henry Borelli, Joey had actually cared about Chris. Detective Pergola gave Joey his condolences. Well, he was suddenly also confused, thinking, wait, Chris Rosenberg? I thought this was Chris Rosalia. That's what the Florida ID says. Chris Rosenberg? Now, where have I heard that name before? Detective Pergola looked at Joey more curiously. Then you can identify the body for me. I don't think I can do that. We've been friends all our lives, Joey said. Not to mention, Joey sure as hell didn't want to give his details out that much, this cop. When Joey Testa gave him his ID when Pergola asked, basic standard protocol, Detective Pergola realized where he had heard Chris Rosenberg for. Chris Rosenberg was the uncharged suspect in that Andre Katz's murder. Frank didn't say anything, and Joey bid him good night and rumbled casually away, probably never expecting to see this cop again. Then Frank realized, Joey, he was charged but acquitted. That was him. Chris, Joey. Frank began searching his memory, and then he began looking around at his surroundings. There was also Anthony and a Henry. Very dark, no cars. There were just a few officers and a truck coming along to deliver Chris's body to the morgue. Then, just as Detective Pergola expected to see, there in the dark shadows was the whispering sound of another Mercedes that resembled the one that Joey Testa had just taken off in. And behind the wheel of that Mercedes was a figure with cold eyes staring back at him. The Mercedes had slowed down while it was passing the scene, but then the car picked up speed and drove off. But not before Frank Pergola memorized the license plates, and then he checked them out. Bingo! Anthony Center. Now where the hell is Henry Borelli? Frank thought to himself dryly. He'd find out an hour later when he went to go see Stephanie Rosalia and deliver the horrific news at her apartment. When he arrived, she was sobbing uncontrollably, and Joey was right there, crying next to her, and there was Anthony. He was looking sullen, but he couldn't quite convince himself enough that he actually cared about Chris to actually shed any tears for the cop. And there was Henry sitting in a chair by himself. And, well, he didn't even try to pretend that he gave a shit about that son of a bitch. He's just glad he's gone. But he didn't smile, he just stared icily around at his surroundings. Well, Detective Pergola came in and asked questions. Joey was the only one who would really answer him. He agreed to an interview, and he explained that he'd been upset already that night, and he'd been at the hospital to see one of his family members. Well, Detective Pergola figured, this sounds like bullshit. Joey's obviously lying about the hospital part. There's more going on than that. And sure enough, when he'd later check, nope, Joey had never been to that hospital that night. I guess Joey forgot that these hospitals have visitor logs. Or maybe they're just not used to cops who actually take their jobs this seriously. When Detective Pergola tried to talk to Anthony or Henry, though, they both kind of got cagey, and they said they didn't know anybody who'd want to hurt Chris. And then they became odd because they weren't suspects, and they both said like drones of each other, "Talk to our lawyer." These people are god-awful, Frank thought with disgust, and these were Chris's closest friends? Jesus. He tried to hide his disdain as he left. He already could figure out, yeah, they had something to do with Chris's murder, even if he couldn't prove it. So, the next day comes along. Roy calls Montiglio and asks him to come down to the Gemini Lounge, which is, of course, just means the clubhouse. Roy was seeming more relaxed today, a little happier than he had in weeks. Killing Chris hadn't been that bad, he momentarily decided. The kid's absence, well, when he started to really notice, that's when he'd start to really grieve. But at that moment, Roy had seemed like he had already gotten over it. And that's when he began explaining to Dominic what happened. "We took care of the problem last night. Chris kept trying to get up, but Anthony shot him, and he stayed down," Roy told Dominic. Maybe even while seated at that same kitchen table where they'd shot Chris. That table was where they did most of their planning, not in the living room down the hall. It was like a cheap wooden clubhouse version of the round table, except for homicidal, drug-addicted sociopaths instead of knights. Dominic nodded and took the newspaper headline about Chris's murder from Roy's hairy big hands. Then he left and delivered the news to Paz. Paz and him smiled, and they agreed it was over. Paz even agreed to a new business arrangement to buy from the crew, and it was going to be lucrative for both of them. Next, Dominic called Nino. "Paz says it's over now, but that fucking Roy didn't even say thanks for all the time I spent trying to iron things out," Dominic complained. "Thanks? What the fuck did you do?" Nino said. "I spent 2 months with a bunch of crazy fucking Cubans," Dominic said. "What the fuck do you want? Another medal? I'll see you at the clubhouse when I get back," Nino said. Later, Dominic met up with Henry, and when they saw each other, they both grinned. Immediately, Henry came over and hugged Dominic in a tight embrace, and he said with a grin, "That cocksucker finally got what he deserved." On the surface, the crew had come out of the Cuban crisis all right. Roy and Joey were the only ones really upset about Chris's death. Roy was pretending to already be over it. There were no contracts out on Roy or any of his men. No arrest warrants would be issued. Underneath, this had been catastrophic, though. When Paul found out about Raguchi's murder, he loathed Roy all the more, felt threatened by having him in his family at all, knew he should kill him already. But this guy kept bringing him so much money. People won't give up on you if you pay them enough. That's what Roy's own mom taught him when she bragged about how wonderful her Roy was when he brought her suitcases full of money. But Paul still wasn't sure Roy was worth all this shit. Still, Nino was strongly backing him. Then there was Frank Pergola. Well, he'd be brought back on the case and determined to finish it. Eventually. Agent Nelson, he'd be told by an informant that Roy whacked some vacuum cleaner salesman, thinking it was a Cuban hitman. And Nelson would think, if this is true, then Roy's days are numbered. Paul won't tolerate that crap. Then there was Roy himself. Roy always struggled with depression at times. Emptiness, chronic sadness. He'd even considered suicide before. Chris had listened and seemed to understand. He really missed that kid, and he felt like he should have never betrayed him. Not for anything. Roy started to really regret betraying Chris, and felt more and more alone. He'd sometimes let it slip he was thinking of suicide, which is almost suicidal itself if you say that in the mob, because they'll whack you for it. Being suicidal, that's considered a weakness, something that rats do. But then Roy would also pull himself up again and again and again with his own ego. Because you see, there was something that made Roy feel better when he was down, something that was therapeutic for him, something that empowered him like nothing else. Made Roy feel in control again in this grim, nihilistic universe. More murder.